This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our Military History Night of October the 3rd, Dr. Charles Godfrey gave a historical survey of Canada's care for our war wounded from the War of 1812 through the war in Afghanistan. A bed for heroes.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's delightful to hear what I didn't do, but it's always nice to hear it over again. I'm delighted to be here tonight, thank you, sir, and see so many of my friends. I'm surprised that people come back to my lectures, but they hope they'll get better, I'm sure. Life goes on, and I found that happens if you just sit still. Then you get to be 101 and there's nothing to it. Having won vast areas from France in 1763, it was necessary for the British to recruit Canadian militia to aid the army. Hear me at the back, okay? Hold up your hand. Yes, okay, thank you. It was wise planning. Pardon me. Thank you. It was wise planning to have the militia because the former colonies south of the border needed little excuse to expand north. With the British Navy seizing American contraband being delivered to the French in Spain, it was politically expedient for President Thomas Jefferson to point out taking Upper Canada was merely a matter of marching. He could have added it was a contemptible army. The Upper Canada Militia was based on the ridings of each county and met once a year for minor military training, usually in work clothes, usually carrying their own weapons. Major General Brock rapidly upgraded this arrangement and organized a training session of 6 times a month, forming regiments as flank companies with 1 captain, subaltern, 1 drummer, and 35 men. They were not paid, but were exempted from jury duty, arrest in civil cases, and protected against bankruptcy. With their new uniform, tunic, they were described as red plowboys. Officers did not buy their commissions, as in the regular army, but commissions depended on the number of recruits they had enlisted. 40 plowboys meant a colonel, sir. 30 meant a majority, and that's the way the militia was formed. This expanded training meant that the hayfoot, strawfoot, created some order, and the recruits began to realize they were part of a government group. It did not take long to put them to work. Much of the country was ignorant of the fact that war had been declared. Brock took a group of 41st British Regiment with 7 militia and occupied Mackinac up on Lake Huron, and occupied that and threw the Americans out. They stayed there for the remainder of the war. On August 15, 1812, the 41st, augmented by 600 Indians and 400 militia, Brock took Fort Detroit. By pulling that uniform red wool, accompanied by Indian war whoops, over the eyes of 560 American regulars and 1,600 militia. The natives carried 1-stroke scalping knives. The victory cost the British 2 wounded and gained 2,300 prisoners and 250 muskets, which were promptly distributed to the militia. A major 4-pronged attack was planned by the Americans, invading at Kingston, Montreal, Amherst, and across the Niagara River. The Niagara American forces had 6,000 regular volunteers and militia, while the British had 70 British regulars, 70, and militia, including 2nd Regiment York, the 5th Regiment Lincoln, and a couple of other in reserve. The Americans attempted an invasion across the river, but only one section was successful and ran into heavy fire on landing. Another effort made a landing and took over the guns. Brock, observing this, made a charge leading 2 companies of militia and was shot dead. Further attempts by 80 Americans were met by York and Lincoln militia, and they were either killed or wounded. In the end, the British held their position and the Americans withdrew. 21 British and Canadians were killed, 83 wounded, and 21 captured. So, being a soldier was no longer a piece of cake. You had to leave your home and family. If they're sick, you're not there to help. While the British had doctors, you might get some treatment. If you're hit seriously, you might need amputation. You can't farm missing a piece. Besides, one fellow with an amputation was seen with his stump loaded with bugs. Sure, you might get a pension. The pension list in October 1817 showed 168 dead, but only 18 got a pension. The town of York was the second choice for the American invaders. On April 27, 1813, a flotilla of ships were off York with invasion forces of 1,800 U.S. infantry. The guns in Fort York were ancient, and their trunnions had been removed so they could not be trained against the Americans. The only troops in York were 300 of the 1st and 3rd Regiments of York Militia, with possibly 50 natives. The Americans' 1st Rifle Regiment landed west of York, and the only resistance was led by the Indian agent James Gibbon with a few Indians. They were outflanked rapidly and had to retreat. A company of rescuing Glengarry Light Infantry became lost. A company of the King's Regiment of Foot charged with bayonets, but were repulsed quickly. General Sheaffe, the commander in charge of the Canadians and the Brits, decided, due to being outnumbered and outgunned, the battle was lost, and retreated to Kingston, leaving the military and citizens, as they said, standing in the street like a parcel of sheep. The Americans advanced into the fort when Pike and the leading American troops were killed by an explosion which wounded 222 of the Americans and Pike seriously. Enraged troops plundered the town, burning buildings, the hospital, the legislative assembly, and eventually they withdrew after looting many of the houses, including that of James Gibbons. That house became a hospital for Mrs. Gibbons, who nursed many of the casualties, and for years was able to point out the red stains on the kitchen floor. The still enraged Americans returned by July the 31st and burned more properties, and there was no resistance at that time. York was once again a second choice. It wasn't the most famous ball in history, but the rapid exit by the Queen's Own Rifle from the concert hall to hurry to Ridgeway was truly a cannon's echo. After the Americans retired from trying to take Canada from England, there was relative peace. There continued to be a problem with an Irish portion of the states, the Fenians, who were striving to end England's reign in their home country. Their strategy was to seize Canada and release Canada only on the departure of the Brits. On June 1, 1866, 1,200 soldiers of the Fenian Brotherhood invaded Canada and began marching towards Toronto. At Ridgeway, They were halted by 850 Canadian militia, including the Queen's Own and the 13th Battalion of Hamilton, with 2 local companies of militia. Their initial superiority as defenders was not maintained, and in a series of chaotic demands, they had to retire, and the Fenians went on to take the town of Ridgeway. Although the invaders had won, they were worried about the news of many Canadian reinforcements coming and decided to withdraw to Fort Erie and wait a mass assistance from the Brotherhood. They never arrived, and the Canadians were a determined army, with the result the Fenians withdraw to the States. Toronto's Dr. Semple arrived with 4 other doctors and found there were 7 Canadians killed and 37 wounded. Among those killed was his son. Some of the wounded were taken to local hospitals, but the majority to Toronto and the newly opened Toronto General Hospital. A grateful crowd and military escort cheered them home. The shot fired by Louis Riel that murdered the Orangeman, Thomas Scott, a surveyor, was not heard around the world, but reverberated to 90,000 citizens of Toronto. It supplied 6 newspapers with inflammatory print, crowding the street with outraged militia who swore to drive the Métis out of the new province of Manitoba. The battle cry was to punish those who did not accept the law and order of this new Canada, which had resulted as the purchase of the West from the Hudson's Bay Company. Riel and his followers demanded a separate recognition of their presence and refused to place alongside the other provinces in the Northwest Territories. When Riel's list of grievances was ignored, a series of attempts by each side for settlement failed. With the result, Ottawa directed the army to maintain peace and order. However, the army had been reduced since the withdrawal of British troops, and it was vital to beef up the small number. Recruits flocked to sign up, and retired Major General Frederick Middleton, who recognized most of the young businessmen, professionals, and office workers as being different than the British soldiers he had recruited from lower levels of society. More than 500 applied. More than 800 applied, 500 were taken. They were walking examples of the militia myth. That excellent soldiers, the militia myth being that excellent soldiers can be made from a citizen first and a soldier only by necessity. A military background was not necessary. This concept had been pronounced by Bishop Strachan in the 1830s, and it gained widespread acceptance. No standing army, no expense. 3 years later, after having lived through freezing weather, abominable barracks, leaking tents, indigestible grub, and confusing orders, by the end of the war, 8,000 militiamen had been active, with only 363 from the professional army. There's been a high level of disease and more than 1,000 wounded or disabled from cold and malnutrition, with 33 Toronto deaths, but only partially controlled by the hospital, which had 6 nuns from Toronto, from St. John's, a complement of newly formed Army hospital attendants, and a Red Cross team. The vociferous of welcome in Toronto on return was possibly a little subdued at the appearance of thin, tanned men in uniforms that were rags. A panel of 4 doctors was formed to examine the militia as to the total or partial disability of the claimants. The opinion of the board was founded on the classifications and regulations and orders of the military manual. The war was not going well for Lord Kitchener. The Boers had expanded their guerrilla tactics. The doctors had not been able to eliminate the mortal diseases. Lord Roberts had retired, leaving the tactic of burning Boer households, putting the women and children into concentration camps, to his successor. Kitchener cursed the bloody women who published his disasters. It is not surprising that Hansie van Morello, a staunch Boer nurse, spread the news of the tragic deaths of families and founded a distress fund. She was an undetected go-between between the locals and the Boer leaders. Lady Sarah Wilson, Winston Churchill's aunt, established a connection with the Daily Mail owner, Lord Northcliffe, and her weekly reports published the grief and horror of a besieged country. The third bloody woman, Emily Hobhouse, was the daughter of the Archbishop of Bodmin in England and the secretary of the Women's South African Conciliation Committee. She stridently denounced the persecution. Arriving in Cape Town with political support from her uncle, she campaigned vigorously against Kitchener's action and was ordered to leave, objected, and was forcibly restrained on a departing steamer to England. Her campaign continued in England, and she wrote a book about the problems. It was uncertain that Canada would send a force to the Boer War. Defense Minister Frederick Borden had led a unanimous Liberal vote to support the British cause. A draft plan for a Canadian contingent under Lieutenant Colonel William Otter rapidly blossomed into a full volunteer army to serve in overseas battles. There was strong objection from pacifists and from the French Canadians. The government boasted only 3,499 of the 8,000 Canadians were to be an expense to the country, as Britain paid all expenses, including pensions. The soldiers' wives, liaison, provided care to the dependents, and donors insured the veterans of life insurance on enlistment. 270 of the 2,200 Imperial troops who died were Canadians. Most of these deaths were due to disease. Unfortunately, the 10th Canadian Field Hospital, including 8 nurses, did not leave Canada until 1902. And it can be seen the reason why the majority of soldiers died of disease rather than rifle shots. The letter from W.S. Dinnick to the Secretary of the Hospital Commission on November the 29th, 1917, was possible an answer to the problem in the city of Toronto. Although a dozen or so city mansions had been donated or rented for use as hospitals, the demand continued to grow. The Davisville Hospital for Amputees, which occupied the Salvation Training Center, was overloaded. Many of the times seen that this is the corner of Davisville and Yonge Street today. And you can see the house is still there with the same directions. Next slide, please. And soldiers walked around and sort of habitated with all the people who came around to see them. And this particular activity was recorded by a painter. It was called Whiz Bang Corner, after whiz bangs which exploded to cause these amputations. And the corner is still there, of course, and the house which you saw earlier is still there. It's a coffee shop now for one of the coffee people. This did serve as a temporary place for soldiers. There were 180 beds, and they made the apparatus there for amputees, but it was never very successful. But Dinnick's proposal to buy the National Cash Register property on Christie Street looked good on paper. It was a factory and would require extensive rebuilding, but it was the only available property that was big enough to be a hospital. Dinnick was a wealthy, respectable Toronto citizen. His Dinnick's Dovercourt Land Building and Savings Company had been successful on the basis of printing attractive descriptions for a very busy commission sales tax. The problem was that Christie Street required a great deal of operation, from its 2.5-story building to a upgraded 4-story building capable of holding 800 beds. Heating and lighting were upgraded, elevators rebuilt, operating and therapy centers were installed. Finally, when it opened, the first batch of veterans came, and a few of these included veterans from the Fenian invasion and also the Boer War. The hospital commission breathed a sigh of relief, which was buried by the curses from the patients swatting the hordes of cockroaches. You had to wear boots going to the can. Sure, you could capture them and have races, but they could drive you crazy. Most of the boys had fleas in France, but these Toronto bugs were over the top. The specialists from downtown Toronto complained about the distance, the noise made by passing freight trains. You couldn't hear the heart, and in particular, the care of tuberculars, who were on the top floor of the 4 stories that had been built in an open wooden structure such you see here. This was a treatment, of course, for tuberculosis in those days, that is, keep them cold and keep them quiet. There's no specific medication for them. This is the early 1900s. Indeed, many of the tuberculars, not in the army, but in the civilian centers, were treated by being kept isolated in old streetcars, which you see here at the sanitarium. And you were in the streetcar there, and you were managed to be fed and that sort of thing, but it wasn't exactly ideal treatment. But in the hospital, there was a good deal of very active treatment. Many of the soldiers had problems with mobilization and moving around, and the nurses would ladle out the food, which the medicine which wasn't particularly appreciated by the men. And a good deal of the work was done by physiotherapists and masseuses. And this is the first time they had really come into prominence. Normally speaking, they were a very small group of people, but as you can see here, the ministering angel is pulling this fellow who's got some shortening of the muscles in his leg, and the next one shows another one who's concerned, and the following one shows once again that a patient is being mastered by the therapist. And indeed, sometimes it was suggested that maybe the patients were losing their masculinity and having give way to the female physiotherapists and masseuses, etc. And I think we have one more slide there. Gives an idea of the difference. And you can see that when you're disabled in a hospital, you're pretty well at the whim of the attendants there. A World War I patient visiting in the 1940s, visiting back to Christie Street, was taken aback that the facilities had not improved. The toilets and washroom, he said, on the third floor were a disgrace. At least 50 to 100 patients with only 4 toilets and 1 tub. The hospital budget was anemic. When the King and Queen visited in the late 30s, it was realized no portraits were available. Numerous Ottawa letters resulted in 2 portraits being purchased from Eaton's for the King and Queen at a cost of $27 each. Ottawa finally said, okay. When the professor, many of the ladies and gentlemen who were visiting the patients had a strange idea of what it was to be an amputation, in particular soldier amputation. And of course this continued even of today. In other words, how did it happen, etc., etc., not what would you like to do, which is the main thing, and we're going to help you do it. When the professor of neurosurgery saw paraplegics in bed soaked in urine, rarely assisted to rise, and contributing to a high record of death, he promptly roared bloody hell, and with John Consul was a paraplegic from Dieppe, they initiated a program which led to the setting up of Lyndhurst Lodge. Colonel Van Nostrand, a World War I veteran who subsequently graduated as a physician and was appointed in charge of Christie psychiatric patients, brought a new, different philosophy of care. In his active service overseas in World War II, when a man reported he could not go back into the lines, labeled as a cell shock or something or other else, then Nostrand gave warmth, food, and counseling for a week. He was not only a psychiatrist, but also a farmer, and pointed out, when the hen no longer lays, she's for the pot. That applied to the warmed-up soldier. Van Nostrand emphasized a realistic understanding of what happens when men and women are involved in war, and stated, we fight our wars with the human material we have, and not with what we think we would like. Those bloody women were at it again. Well, this is the hospital where you would send them on. Those bloody women were at it again. They paraded on Yonge Street in front of the Imperial Theatre. This is a women's group who had come to know what was going on at Christie Street Hospital. And they paraded with these billboards demanding, get our soldiers out of Christie Street Hospital and give them clean, bug-free sanitary beds. The issue was whiz-banged by the arrival of a train with hundreds of wounded Canadians. There were no beds. Christie was chock full, and the government was fiddling with adding buildings. It was a stale song by tone-deaf politicians who had never played at Christie Street. Private Scott believed in miracles, like the time he was in a firing party for the burial of Dieppe casualties. After firing his shots, he heard his name being read out as among the dead. He had a similar problem in believing reality when he awoke the day after he was transferred from Christie Street to Sunnybrook Hospital. The brilliant white sheets, the painted walls and ceiling, the quiet, and there were no bugs. After a quarter of a century, the penny-pinching government had built a new facility, and Christie Street was headed for deconstruction because it was unfit for humans. Those bloody women may not have imagined 23 operating rooms, special centers for rheumatoid and chest disorders, a large prosthetic department for the provision of arms, legs, and braces, specific areas for the paralyzed, a whole wing for psychiatric patients, hospital floors with alcoves of 4, 6, or 12 beds with sinks, toilets, and showers, and a dining room if you did not want to eat by the bed. There were a few private rooms for officers who were severely impaired. There was a pool and gym, a hospital library, and Pink Ladies, the name was changed later, served coffee and cigarettes. The cigarettes were changed later. There was an auditorium for movies, plays, and meetings, a ballpark ready for the patients who were ready to go home, and most pleasant, instead of locomotive whistles, you could hear the birds. And on the same property, separated from the hospital by grass and trees, there was a veterans' retirement building for those who could no longer manage at home. Such creature comfort was gratifying, but more importantly, there was a staff of university professors. Ian MacDonald, a famous internist, ex-service, had insisted that Sunnybrook was a teaching hospital of the University of Toronto and had a staff of specialists and a corps of interested, anxious interns. The arthritis section included Professor Wallace Graham, and Professor Arthur Squires did the GI problems and others. Although it was a military hospital, rank was checked at the door, but somehow the admitting intern was sometimes overwhelmed by an irate colonel who insisted he came there every year for 10 days rest. During the winter months, some roomless boys, without a specific diagnosis, could apply the sesame. I vomited blood in the snow, and he was admitted. After World War II casualties, the Korean veterans were admitted. However, by 1966, the number of casualties decreased. The government closed military hospital. Sunnybrook was sold to the province of Ontario for $1. Nuns and churches were the first responders to help soldiers in early England. In London, St. Thomas, St. Bartholomew's, and then the Savoy Hospital, which later became a hotel, cared for Parliament service soldiers. With the enlargement of the British forces, the Royal Hospital at Haslar and the Royal Navy Hospital at Netley in 1856 were opened. In Upper Canada, the casualty just took his look that someone might help. British Army doctors frequently shared with the militia. The only hospital at Queenston was rapidly overloaded, so casualties were wagoned to the surrounding towns. When the Americans took York, the hospital was destroyed. After Ridgeway, the recently built hospital was available, but there were no nurses or physicians wise in the treatment of wounds or amputations. It was not until Christie Street that expert staff was available with less morbidity, and amputees had a better chance of walking. Heroes were finally getting expert care at Sunnybrook. Hospitals had to change over the century. Sir Charles Bell, a Wellington surgeon, dealt with many musket ball wounds. This soldier, who took one in the head and also in the chest, laid for days in the field. Musket ball shots caused tearing of soft tissues, and bone fractures were common in Upper Canada and frequently required amputation. The Canadian troops in the Boer War suffered from disease and rifle shots. In World War I, high explosive shells frequently broke or injured legs. The soldiers managed to struggle back to some safety using a gun as a crutch, but the movement of the fracture in his leg increased, which went on to an amputation. The problem was solved by stretcher bearers immediately immobilizing the leg in what was called a Thomas splint. Prolonged exposure on the battlefield due to the wire caused many pulmonary problems and gangrene. Specialized hospitals were required for gassed soldiers. In World War II, high explosives caused multiple injuries. In Afghanistan, the loss of limbs from IED explosions demanded expert care on the spot by a prepared, pre-trained member of a four-man squad, and then to the hospital in minutes, not hours. The first 24 hours were crucial. Each of these conflicts demanded and got an upgraded medical service, which needed a special backup to reduce mortality and morbidity. A bed for a hero demanded expert care and eventually received it. However, there was one area that lagged. You can put a soldier, sailor, flyer, or maritime in uniform, pick up that rucksack, and the response will be perfect. Standing guard, marching, shooting at targets will not differ. Wound any of them, and there will be a mixed response. Captain Melu, who was injured in Afghanistan, or Lieutenant John Consul, the DF veteran, attacked their recovery with faith, enthusiasm, and obstinacy, leading to independence again. In the same rehab center, instruction was the same, programs were stimulating, and the staff was understanding and sympathetic for a fellow wounded, but no improvement. The staff discusses failure, can't agree why. Not getting along well at home, suffering from PTSD, he's been a loser all his life, never should have been in the Army in the first place. I can't give up, but I just cannot figure out the best way to look at this problem. Despite all the current sophisticated testing, lectures from psychologists and other experts, there has never been agreement between the professionals about how the wounded should be cared for, either before or after the incident. It's been a long road since Bishop Strawn baptized a citizen soldier. Deaths from amputation are rare. The epidemics amongst the battalions are reduced. The bed for heroes has become immense. Our brothers and sisters in combat receive medical care, help in gaining employment, compensation for lost or reduced pay, families receiving benefits, and so on. The health and well-being of female or male vets is provided by appropriately trained healthcare providers. Members of Parliament have a special interest. However, disability is still a major component. You can see the problems that are approached when a person is applying and receive compensation or pension, as the case may be. As you can see, there's quite a mixed pattern of disorders you can have. But let's go on to the next slide. And that slide shows a very interesting fact. If you look under the column Afghan veterans, you can see, if you look under the column which says Afghan veterans, you can see a very interesting fact. 4% of those who applied for a pension on the basis of PTSD were refused. Other people, other soldiers, other warriors who asked for compensation for pension with a number of other things, including mechanical things, were running at 15 to 20% refused. The most common problem, as you can see, is tinnitus. Well, in this room, at least 8 people will now have tinnitus, and they manage to get along with it. It's a very common disorder, particularly if you've been around the door of the hatch door of a heavy transport coming in, then you know what noise is and what tinnitus is. The others have a certain amount of loss of hearing, which is not uncommon in the civilian population, but the incidence of PTSD and the other problems as you look down that list, which are attributed to the veterans from Afghanistan, show there's a little imbalance somewhere or other. This is not carping about a group of our fellows or female warriors who cannot manage. It's surprising that this trio of women have had so much influence on history. They were able to challenge the British government and reduce the unspeakable crimes on helpless women and children, curb the disease death, and alert the voters of the UK of the unacceptable practices. In World War II, 25,000 wounded were sustained, and 9,000 prisoners, of whom required and received excellent medical care. We continue to act as peacekeepers, and our casualties receive the same quality and benefits. The women who paraded on Yonge Street shattered society's shibboleths and re-scripted the care of the wounded. But the bed for heroes, which has expanded to an unpredictable size, still demands a voice that shouts that the current program must be perfected. Yonge Street is there for another group of bloody women. Thank you. I'll just add one moment. Come up, Pat. Sure, come on. I'll be short. Yeah. If there's any beauty in the presentation of mine, visual beauty, this is the man who caused it, Tom Klein.
We will now take a few questions. Go ahead. Anybody got a question?
Back there.
No?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Dr. Godfrey, in the history of the Sunnybrook Hospital and the veterans' hospitals at the end of the Second World War, I believe that there were only roughly 10 veterans' hospitals in Canada in 1939, and that program was expanded immensely by the casualties in the Second World War to something like 39 veterans' hospitals.
I'm afraid I can't give you the number. As I said, in the World War II, there were 25,000 wounded and 9,000 prisoners. That's 34,000. The hospitals were pretty well crowded. They couldn't have got along without the civilian hospitals as well, because many of the wounded were in, for example, the East General and other places like that.
Correct. What I was leading to was how many civilian or convalescent hospitals were there in both the Second World War and the First World War.
I'm afraid I can't give you the numbers of that, sir. In World War II, there were 15 major military hospitals across Canada, one pretty well in each province. The one in Halifax. In Halifax, as World War I, as you remember the explosion there were two explosions. One explosion, everybody heard, and they ran to the window to see what happened, and the second explosion blew the windows in, which led to the setting up of the blind hospital, whatever the name it was, of those people on. That was later used for the military as well. I can't tell you there were dozens of smaller hospitals. For example, Ottawa had some veterans in there, and they've been used over very widely across Canada. And it's a problem now that we have veterans coming back who are being wounded. One of the main things in recovering from being wounded or hurt or sick or what have you is some sort of arrangement, some sort of understanding you have with the people you're with in your room, in your hospital, or what have you. Here, a veteran, if he comes back, he goes into a standard hospital. Nobody knows that he's a veteran, he may tell them. Nobody can sympathize with him as to what's going on. Now, the staff know he's a veteran, and they may give him special care or not. But this is one of the problems. Now, the simple fact of the matter is we haven't got enough soldiers to justify military hospitals. The last one in Quebec is still partial military, but there's no military hospital otherwise. The one at Ottawa was closed just recently. Now, I'm not saying we should have more veterans so we can have more injuries, so we can have more hospitals. That isn't the basis of my argument. But that's about the only solution for it. I spoke with a very good friend of mine in the military, and we had a frank conversation. And I said, "Do you think there's going to be another war?" And he looked me straight in the face and said, "Of course." Now, they didn't build a big army back when the militia were there because they didn't think there's going to be a war, and eventually there was, of course. There was no preparation for it. So I don't know what should be our approach outside of prevent the war, which of course is the best solution, but there's no doubt that in the future we're going to be going down the same path as before, looking for areas to put wounded soldiers. Pat?
I'm thinking of Dr. Herbert Bruce, who was in the Canadian Army Medical Corps in the First World War and serving on the Western Front, who was highly critical of the way the Army was providing medical care for the soldiers. And when he returned to Toronto, he continued to be a thorn in the side of the medical establishment. And I believe he then went on to found the Wellesley Hospital and got permission from the Duke of Wellington's family, the Wellesleys, to use their coat of arms as part of the Wellesley Hospital coat of arms. But I wonder if you could comment on him?
Herbert Bruce was a fantastic fellow.
Yes.
His concern, he was sent by Sam Hughes to England to look over the medical services being provided to the veterans, the soldiers in the UK. What he found out, there was no special consideration for Canadian soldiers. They were just mixed up with the other ones. He found out that 2 Canadian soldiers were way up in the north of Scotland, had been in a hospital there for months, and nobody ever saw them. His major contention was, if you're going to have Canadian soldiers, you've got to have Canadian doctors taking care of them, because the simple fact of the matter was, the physicians in England who were taking care of soldiers in the military hospitals were ordinary GPs who had no idea of how to take care of a wounded soldier. And he came back and gave a report to that. It really boiled up into a major fight, and even Sir William Osler felt it was a storm in a teapot. But the simple factor was, eventually it was agreed the Canadian soldiers would be handled in Canadian hospitals by Canadian doctors and nurses as much as possible, because he was concerned that the British couldn't do it as well as the Canadians would, which was right, quite right. We talked about the noise in the hospital. He brought up in the House of Commons the fact you can't hear a heart beating when you hear those trains going by. And eventually that was proven to be the case. He was a fantastic fellow. There's a book been written on him. I'll send you a copy of it.
Catherine. So Charles and I are colleagues from the Wellesley Hospital, and I'm a graduate of the Wellesley Hospital, and the motto is the same as the Duke of Wellington, Jamais sans espérance. So I'm privileged to have that name, Hope. A couple of things to add to what Charles said in support of that. One of the most important things we have here in Toronto is we have Sunnybrook Hospital. I belong to Fort York Branch 165 of the Legion, and anybody who belongs to the Legion, one of the difficulties is when you have a large organization like the Ontario government or OHIP, we need to preserve part of the provenance of Sunnybrook Hospital, because there are going to be more veterans who are going to need care. And of course, anyone who's been a head nurse in emergency or ICU and needs a bed, we call it bed spacing, find someone where to go. So one of the things that we're doing is we're working hard to make sure that Sunnybrook keeps that provenance for veterans. And particularly, there are a lot of veterans right now who are out in community hospitals or nursing homes or holding up hospital beds who need to go into a facility that understands their history and their background. Charles, am I not speaking loud enough? Was I speaking too quickly?
Can't hear you, but everyone else can.
Okay, I'll talk to Charles out. So that's something you all need to think about. And one of the concepts that Sunnybrook has is to follow up with what Charles was saying, is to make sure there's a unit in each province that can be there for older veterans and then for younger veterans. The second thing I wanted to say is, if none of you have seen the movie The 4th of July, watch that movie about Vietnam veterans and what happened to them when they came back to the United States into care. You know, really gives you an idea of what many of our veterans have gone through. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge this and recognize this, and also to realize what Charles said is, there will be another conflagration, so we need to be better prepared.
And certainly Sunnybrook pioneers a great deal of care for the veterans, and I appreciate your comments there. There's still a very large area devoted to veterans, but of course they're not in the hospital. It's a separate setup altogether, and it's very valuable that it's there.
Any more questions? No? Yes, Paul.
Are there any books on the topic we went through tonight?
Any books on this topic? Any books on this topic?
Not yet. There's well, sir, as you can see, as is happening even here at the Institute, everybody's on the 100th anniversary. There are all sorts of new books being issued this year which repeat the same things that have been said before with a little extra twist on them. I'm sure that there'll be more. There's a very good book by Granatstein on talking about these soldier civilians or civilian soldiers who are not professionals. And that's a very interesting read because, as he points out, you don't win wars with civilian soldiers. You got to have professional soldiers, just the same as a lot of people like to practice medicine, but I know what I'm doing, and it doesn't work that way with civilian soldiers.
Thank you very much, Charles, for a really enlightening topic. And hurry up with that book. I want to read it. Thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.